A reminder to folks, if you would like to access our closed captioning, you should be able to see a closed captioning option at the bottom of your Zoom webinar. If you're watching us on Facebook, you should see it automatically as we transmit live. All right. We'll give folks maybe another 30 seconds or so to settle in, and then we'll get started. All right, I'll pass over to you, Omar.
All right, thank you. So good morning to all of our viewers. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Omar Zaza, and I'm the Education and Advocacy Coordinator for Eyewitness Palestine, as well as a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement. I have the great honor of moderating today's panel about how institutions of power erasing Palestinian stories and demands works to perpetuate colonization and repressive policies that harm Palestinians. We're joined by some truly incredible speakers, and in just a few moments, we'll be giving their names and biographies, and then opening it up for an extended conversation. But before I do so, I just want to say a few brief words about the political moment in which we find ourselves. On the one hand, there have been some unforeseen developments regarding institutional political support for Palestinian rights in the US. Ahead of Israel's threatened date of annexation in July, a letter calling to condition US military funding on stopping ongoing and threatened annexation policies was introduced in Congress and signed by over a dozen lawmakers. And on August 14th, Representative Betty McCollum and several co-sponsors introduced the Israeli Annexation Non-Recognition Act to Congress, which began to make the promises of this letter a reality. The legislation prohibits any US funding to go towards formal annexation, but does not go all the way to condition, or as we may demand, end military funding to Israel. Despite some good movement, a great deal of work remains to be done on the US front. Institutionally speaking, neither platform of either of the two major political parties in the US includes challenges to US funding of Israel, despite Israel's unmitigated and ongoing pattern of colonizing Palestinian land and of continuing to enforce entrenched and violent systems of apartheid and military occupation against Palestinians. Activism and organizing for Palestinian liberation continues to face intense repression across the US, spanning from US campuses to state governments, as activists for Palestine face an array of challenges spanning from incendiary blacklist sites like Canary Mission to administrative hostility to student activism, and even state legislation seeking to criminalize BDS work on behalf of Palestinian freedom. As Palestinian intellectuals such as Rabab Abdul Hadi have pointed out time and time again, the silencing of Palestinians thus goes hand in hand with the ongoing colonial dispossession and displacement of Palestinian land and bodies, and there can be no true justice until Palestinian narratives and demands are centered unconditionally with full agency. For all too often, Palestinians are deemed disposable when they refuse to lend their voices to prop up colonial mythologies, as witnessed in mid-July when the New York Times refused to interview Al-Qaus, a Palestinian queer liberation organization, when the group told reporters that they would not take part in an interview if it also featured Zionist organizations. That is, organizations that in their ideology support the ongoing colonization of Palestinian land and the military colonial oppression and deprivation of rights of the Palestinian people. In response, the Times not only omitted Al-Qaus's perspective, but falsely claimed that the organization refused to be interviewed due to the inclusion of Jewish perspectives, thus willfully and strategically misrepresenting an explicit opposition to colonial ideology as yet another manifestation of the myth of a centuries-old religious struggle to falsely define Palestinian indignation against repression. Beyond erasure in general, this censorship is also symptomatic of an arrogant and paternalistic need to force a rigid idea of what queer liberation means and looks like, marking it as discontinuous with anti-colonial praxis and imposing a flattening projection of who does and doesn't get to do this type of work. When we speak of the need to heed Palestinian stories and demands, we do not mean merely to add a token Palestinian to a panel, but to add them completely with full agency and with total recognition of the fact that a sharp and stark asymmetry of power has defined the Palestinian experience for 72 years, from Israel's so-called founding via brutal and violent ethnic cleansing up to the present. Internationally, even as the United Arab Emirates has moved to normalize relations with Israel, the world cannot look away from the grave injustices that continue to be meted out to the Palestinian people or ignore their stories any longer. Enough is enough.
Thanks, Omar. I just want to take a short moment to thank, the huge number of different progressive orgs who have co-sponsored this event. If you joined us a little earlier, you may have seen this, but we just really want to thank, all the organizations who've turned out hundreds of people to listen to this really important event and our vital speakers and amplify the demands for justice for Palestinians. Thank you so much to you all, and we look forward to building further with you in the future.
Okay, and this is Omar again. Just very quickly, before we jump into the bios, I wanted to give some quick ground rules for the rest of the conversation. So bearing in mind that euphemism is one of the larger strategies for having kept unconscionable, unethical, and oppressive policies in regards to Palestinians unchallenged for so long, I'd like for us to refrain from using such euphemisms in our own comments and responses unless we're quoting statements or raising a point about the power behind naming. So otherwise, let's try to use language more in line with the actual political realities on the ground. So for example, let's not uncritically repackage the term settlement, right? Let's call them what they actually are, which is colonies. Rather than settler, let's use colonizer, apartheid wall in place of the laughable separation fence, so on and so forth. Colonization acts on the mind as well as the land, so let's just try to keep the power at bay. And we will be having closed captioning and ASL interpretation. So in addition to speakers quickly reintroducing ourselves before we speak, let's also try not to interrupt one another when speaking, and remember to speak slowly. I know I definitely sometimes need to work on that one, and clearly so everybody can understand. I think with that, I'll turn it back over to Sanat for speaker bios, and then we can jump into the questions.
Thank you, Omar. This is Sana. I just wanted to quickly introduce our wonderful speakers. The full bios are available on the Facebook event. We'll drop the link in the chat if you'd like to see them. They're very, very accomplished folks, so I'm just going to read brief snippets today. I'll start with Yara Hawari, who is the Senior Palestine Policy Fellow of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. She is, of course, a wonderful person to follow, but in addition, Al-Shabaka has, it's a network of Palestinian policy analysts, and we encourage everyone to follow their work and really amplify it and learn from it. Then we have Tala Al-Fuqaha at the University of Minnesota. She's currently a senior at the University of Minnesota and has done organizing with Students for Justice in Palestine at the University of Minnesota, as well as national organizing with the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Alongside her organizing, she expresses her vision of a liberated Palestine through art. Then we have Sahar Francis with Adamia. Since 2006, Sahar has been the general director of the Ramallah-based Adamir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association. It's a Palestine NGO providing legal and advocacy support to Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli and Palestinian prisons. Then we have Amira Matar with Palestine Legal. She's a Palestinian American attorney and the Michael Ratner Justice Fellow at Palestine Legal. He specializes in challenging the censorship, suppression, and surveillance of Palestinian rights advocates in the US. And finally, we have Nas Abdalal with Al-Qaws. Nas is a Palestinian organizer, a freelance designer, and the 2020 Summer Fellow with Al-Qaws for Gender and Sexual Diversity in Palestinian Society. Thank you so much to you all, and I'll pass it back to Omar.
Okay, this is Omar, and yes, I just want to echo the thanks to everybody for joining us, despite all of these different time zones and all of these different things that are going on. There's definitely a lot happening, but repression doesn't slow down, and so obviously, we also can't slow down. So with that, let's go ahead and just jump into the discussion. And the first question for you all isn't really a question; it's more of an invitation for each speaker just to talk for about 3 minutes about the work of your organizations. What do you do, and in what way does your work make Palestinians more visible, and uplift the fight for representation and power, and directly interrupt the continuation of Palestinian oppression. And yes, feel free to go in the order of the bios if that's simplest.
Sure, I'll start. This is Yara. So I'm the Senior Policy Fellow for Shabaka. Shabaka is a Palestinian think tank. We're a network of Palestinian experts in all different fields, all over the world, not only in the Middle East and in Palestine, but also in the US and Europe. And what really the aim of a Shabaka is to put Palestinian voices, especially policy and expertise voices, in areas that we have been marginalized from for so long. We know that Palestinian voices are not preferred or not prioritized when talking about the situation in Palestine, not only in the mainstream media, but also we're talking about the higher echelons of political institutions. And so Shabaka really sees itself as one of the many tools that we can use to really push those voices out there, to show that we do exist, and we do exist in expertise and professionalism, and that we can narrate our own story, and that there is no excuse to continue with the exclusion, because we know that commonly the excuse is that Palestinians can't talk about it, that Palestinians are not there, that they're not educated, that they don't have the knowledge. But we do have all of this. We have, an incredibly knowledgeable people. And so Shabaka is just one of the many ways in which we're really trying to put forward the Palestinian voice, but in particular the Palestinian policy voice in the think tank world.
Hi, this is Talis speaking. So yeah, I'm currently a student at the University of Minnesota, involved in campus and grassroots organizing with Students for Justice in Palestine and with US Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Focusing on campus organizing, I guess speaking to kind of the role that plays in shaping narrative, with academia being rightfully treated as, spaces that are very insular from outside forces, but also being places of, knowledge production, socialization, and often radicalization. I'd say the primary way that Students for Justice in Palestine operates, and just campus organizing in general, is through kind of disruption of dominant narratives that are reproduced in academia, by being unapologetic about uplifting Palestinian rights and calls to boycotts in spaces that would otherwise be quite detached from the reality and urgency of both. So, with the divestment campaigns that we do, there's a huge component of community education and Palestinians kind of shaping their own narrative of what that is. And alongside that, there's communal education among the organizers within spaces such as the Students for Justice National Conference that the University of Minnesota actually hosted this past year. And with US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, I'm in the process of working on a campaign aimed at a congressional audience. And a lot of that is also targeted towards messaging and being able to get our messaging out there, using congressional platforms to reproduce that. And then on a more personal basis, I write articles and essays and social media posts, which I'm sure we all do. And I think that writing is a very literal way to be able to control our narratives and radically assert ourselves as agents of knowledge production.
Hello, and I'm Sahar Francis, human rights lawyer and the director of Ad-Damir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association based in Ramallah. Actually, Ad-Damir representing Palestinian prisoners mainly under the occupation in the military courts and the civil courts in Israel, but we do also represent political prisoners under the Palestinian Authority as well. The main focus for us is documenting all kinds of violations through our legal representation and the visitation to the prisons. And based on this information that we collect, we do this advocacy on behalf of the prisoners in order to bring the voices of the prisoners to the different stages, whether the official level with the UN, the EU, and other states, or with activists and grassroots. And we do emphasize and put lots of efforts in the comparison and actually the coordination and cooperation with similar groups in different countries, not just in the United States, but also in other European countries and in Latin American countries, with groups that advocates for the prisoners, political prisoners' rights. And this is why it's a very important meeting today for us, and to make these connections between how we fight such violations and how we connect the imprisonment policy and the control for the whole society in a context of colonization. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. No.
No, you're fine. Go ahead. Okay. Well, this is Emira Matar speaking. I'm from Palestine Legal. I'm the Michael Ratner Justice Fellow there. I was a former SJP member when I was in college, where we did divestment. And for those who don't know, we are a legal organization committed to the grassroots Palestine rights movement in the US. We protect the constitutional and civil rights of advocates who face threats, harassment, bullying for standing in support of Palestinian rights and who face punishment for it. A Palestinian that dares to speak about their community's experience, or a Palestinian that dares to give power to their very own, is immediately confronted by a network of tools aimed to suppress that very voice. We have, students are dragged into administrative proceedings because they protested an anti-Palestinian speaker. A professor is denied tenure because they critique the colonization of Palestinian lands. Thousands are placed on blacklists in hopes of advocates internalizing their silence through public vilification. So we're confronted by a censorship regime of anti-boycott laws, redefinitions of anti-Semitism, repressive legislation that restricts the right to dissent, to protest, to campus free speech, subversive uses of civil rights laws. All of this, of course, with the intent to silence liberation activists, to detract them, to threaten them so that they're no longer able to shake the status quo. And we support, as Palestine Legal, we support the liberation movement here in the US through a movement lawyering framework where we follow the demands of the grassroots, you. And we work in unison with the community using the tool and of course the extent of the law as activists push forward those radical transformations so that their visions for the future are realized. So thank you very much for having me today, and I'm so excited to connect with you all.
Hi, sorry again, Amira, for that little snafu. But I'm Naz. I'm the 2020 Summer Fellow with Al-Qaus for Sexual and Gender Diversity in Palestinian Society. My background in queer, feminist, and Palestinian politics grew out of my experience as a diaspora Palestinian here in the US, and also through my work as a campus organizer with Students for Justice in Palestine throughout my undergrad. For this fellowship, I focus primarily on building links between Al-Qaus and the Palestinian solidarity movement abroad, as well as building out a network of queer Palestinian organizers in the diaspora who want to connect with the work happening in the homeland. Al-Qaus is a grassroots queer organization that operates across Palestine, building community, engaging broader civil society, and organizing against colonial, capitalist, and patriarchal forms of oppression. I first encountered their work before my freshman year of college and have been following them ever since. I think for many young queer Palestinians, having such an organization on your horizon is incredible because you see yourself reflected in the work. It shows you that queer and feminist politics aren't peripheral to the anti-colonial struggle. They must be an integral part of it. And so what makes Al-Qaus exciting is that it doesn't just build community among queer Palestinians, it also provides a political home. It provides a space for autonomous, holistic, grassroots organizing. So on that note, it's important to clarify that Al-Qaus isn't an LGBT rights advocacy group. it doesn't present itself as representing or advocating for all of the queer and trans communities around Palestine. Al-Qaws is a political queer organization for Palestinians who believe that questions of gender and sexual diversity are inextricable from the colonial context and from other forms of oppression that Palestinians face. And a lot of that work revolves around this question of erasure, which Omar touched on in their introduction. Queer Palestinians are often spoken about and treated as if we're a contradiction in terms. We can either be queer and rejected as Palestinian, or we can be Palestinian and rejected as queer. And I'll talk later about how this belief is rooted in a kind of colonial mythology, which is internalized within Palestinian communities. This erasure is also propagated abroad through a form of propaganda called pinkwashing, which uses the language of sexual rights to promote Israel as this gay haven and depict Palestinian society as backwards, regressive, and homophobic in order to justify ongoing colonial violence. To combat this, there's a need to approach queerness not simply as a form of identification, but as a radical approach to political mobilization that can directly speak back to this erasure and colonial violence. And working with Al-Qaws, you can see how their analysis can equip us with the tools to do that. So thank you.
Hi, this is Omar again. So thank you all for sharing your, your occupational, organizational backgrounds, as well as the beliefs that inform the work that you do. And also just reminding us that a lot of us work in many, many different spaces in addition to the main orgs we're a part of. I think it's important to keep that in mind. But so moving forward to the next question, speaking of this idea of moving across several different spaces, I've been in several different contexts, as an organizer myself, but like some of you, I got my start in Palestine work through student activism, specifically via Students for Justice in Palestine in 2012. And what I think people may not always realize about university campuses in the US is that the types of repression we face and continue to face as organizers and activists on campuses, it's actually directly continuous, right, with the forms of repression and justice-centered activism that play out other parts of the US and then even internationally, right? There isn't as much of a separation, I think, in some ways, as we might like to believe. So I know that some of you have already initiated some of these conversations, but I'm wondering if each of you could speak briefly about specific experiences of repression of the type of work you've had and how you think they're part of the bigger picture of Palestinian dehumanization and oppression.
This is Yara. I guess I'll start with this one. Ahmed, you mentioned sort of more student-based repression. My higher education experience was in the UK, and there was just as much perhaps repression in terms of Palestinian voices on campuses. All the kinds of things that we've already heard about happen in the UK as well, bringing on, former IDF people, veterans on campus, spewing anti-Palestinian rhetoric, having, Palestinian voices shut down and removed from campus, but also more insidious things, such as sort of Middle East centers being very dominantly white and shutting down research projects of students of color or Palestinian students who perhaps want to take on a more critical lens. So all of those things also exist very much in the UK. In terms of repression in Palestine itself, in terms of policy work, it is very difficult to pursue political work in Palestine. And Sahar can talk much more about this at length, I'm sure. But you're facing not only oppression from a settler colonial regime, which doesn't want you to narrate your story, and so they there's all kinds of ways that they will repress you in Palestine. Students are frequently arrested by the Israeli settler colonial regime for merely being involved in any kind of form of activism or even being intellectually active. So there's a whole myriad of ways that happens, but also it's also important to mention that the Palestinian Authority is also repressive, especially when it comes to political critique and internal critique, and that's something that we always need to call out and bear in mind. And at Shabaka, our work is political analysis, so this is the sort of this is the realm where we might, face the most oppression is from for writing or speaking about something or sharing something on social media. So I won't go too much into that because I know that Sahel will cover a lot of this, and perhaps we can talk a bit more in the questions later.
Yeah, this is Talis speaking, and yeah, as someone who is currently a college student, I would say I'm definitely still kind of in the thick of this dynamic, because repression is so rampant on college campuses and manifests in so many different ways on different levels of power, from your peers to the highest levels of administration, so yeah, for example, the University of Minnesota has had multiple divestment campaigns, and besides the blatant harassment and doxing that the leaders of those campaigns faced, and people supporting it being put on Canary Mission with all their information, obviously being misconstrued and put out there. Our former university president issued a letter both times, publicly renouncing the campaigns. And interestingly, 81 state legislators had actually sent him a letter prior to him making a statement urging him to do so and quell the campaign. And I think that's kind of indicative of a broader pattern of outside forces really pouring resources and pressure into the kind of advocacy that happens on college campuses, which I think is indicative of how important that advocacy is and how important and powerful that they know, outside forces know that it can be, because the structures that we see on campus and yeah, on college campuses kind of feed into that sort of repression outside of it, with forms of intellectual repression or narrative repression, where also students who don't know much about the situation of Palestinians are offered free trips to Israel, and so in that way they're sort of indoctrinated before their Palestinian narrative or voice is ever able to reach them. And yeah, so I think that kind of shows how inextricable the kind of repression we see on college campuses is from repression we even see in congressional spaces where members of Congress are given free trips to Israel, and then from your peers when there are divestment campaigns that are brought up and people kind of discarding it as too controversial, which is a coded way of saying that we should just shut up, and an easy way to shut down the conversation. And I think we hear those buzzwords a lot in real life too, of calling this issue controversial or complex, which are really just ways to avoid ascribing any real responsibility or actually listening to Palestinians, which I think is another form of repression.
Yes, this is Sahar. So I think, as Yara said, in the Palestinian internal, like in Palestine here in the occupied territories, the attacks and the like incitement, the arrest, there's several ways how organizations, especially working on human rights issues and especially in the international level, networks like the PDS, students. At the end of the day, every Palestinian could be subjected for all these harassments and difficulties that can include ban on travel from outside the occupied territory, moving from one place to another in certain periods. But the most worst thing would be the imprisonment. And actually lately we are facing an increase in attacking students, in attacking human rights defenders. Like just this week, Mahmoud Nawaj'a, the coordinator for the PDS, the BNC in Palestine, was released after 19 days of interrogation. Tasneem El-Qadi, a master's student, she is still in detention for more than 2 weeks and under interrogation and without being able even to meet the lawyer in this period. Damir, for example, and not just Damir is one of the organizations that is facing a very intense campaign against our work. This includes like arresting several staff members in this last 5-6 years, raiding the office several times, confiscating laptops and taking some documents and missing the whole office. This includes ban on travel on the board of members from the board of directors, and so on, and the whole smear campaign associating the work of human rights organizations actually with terror. And I think here I would like to highlight that all this actions by the Israelis trying to associate the work of human rights defenders and the human rights organizations with terrorism is a part of the whole policy of the war on terror that the United States started to develop in 2001. Actually, there's lots of, I think, sharing information, strategizing together how we can undermine the work of grassroots and such groups by claiming that they are associated with terror in order to affect their work on very serious issues like discrimination, colonialism, and so on. So I think it's very, very important to look about the bigger picture when we discuss targeting students, whether in the United States acting for Palestine or acting for other causes that could be connected with the Palestinian cause, or attacking students and activists inside the occupied territories or inside Israel or in other places. Thank you.
This is Amira speaking. When I, think about this question, I think I think in terms of I've been exposed to repression on like 3 distinct separate levels. I think one, which every panelist has mentioned, is as a student, and there's a reason for that. There's a special emphasis placed on the university environment because it's where young minds are shaped, where political thought is influenced and impressed upon. And so efforts to quash are not only at the helm of the Israel lobby and their numerous resources on campus, but also, moderates who tout harmful neoliberal discourses that continue to subjugate Palestinians. And we have there's ways of censorship and repression on the campus, all the way from the major forms of censorship, like stopping a debate on divestment from happening or banning an SJP from being on campus, like at Fordham University, down to the microaggressions of like a administrator delaying their responses to your email when you're trying to book a room for a Palestine event. I've also seen repression as a lawyer, stepping out of the shoes of an organizer and stepping into the legal field, which is it's an institution that has historically protected supremacist forces. It really drives home the notion of who these laws are meant to serve and whose interests are prioritized as they currently stand. And we'll speak more about that, I'm sure, in the webinar. But of course, I've experienced like repression simply as a Palestinian. To go through the day as a Palestinian is a race against erasure and silencing, to witness not only the dismissal of Palestinian voices, but the very intentional distortion of them, to be subject to collective punishment and examples made out of as a warning to sit down, to internalize this into our thought processes, to second guess whether we should do what it is that we desire. And it feels as though you're being placed in a position where a Palestinian's tongue could cost them the very thing that they love. So all sufficient to say, Palestinians face mountains of repression from every angle in their lives.
I think on that note, I sort of wanted to draw a continuity from something from Omar's intro, where they mentioned this incident that happened with the New York Times, where Al-Quds refused to be interviewed for an article because they didn't want to be interviewed alongside Zionist colonial organizations that are invested in their dispossession. And later, the author of that article took to Twitter to accuse Al-Quds of refusing to be interviewed because they didn't want to be interviewed alongside Jewish organizations. And when I was a student organizer at Columbia University, we encountered a very similar dynamic. This effort to render the Palestinian historical narrative illegitimate through associating it with anti-Semitism and through this redefinition of anti-Semitism that is conflated with anti-Zionism. So that's a very significant continuity, because it basically aims to, like say that the Palestinian lived experience is bigoted, hateful, irrational, and that we aren't capable of, formulating like a complex political analysis of our situation, and also rejecting our oppression and colonization. So it was interesting to see how, that's a thread that I could see very clearly moving from a student organizing context to even like a queer grassroots Palestinian organizing context.
Cool, thank you all. This is Omar again. And, before I get to the next question, I just wanted to flag really quickly, this event is part of the broader work of the Invest in Justice Coalition, which features things such as the Freedom is the Future platform, which you can check out on freedomisthefuture.org, and so that's one concrete way for the demands of Palestinians, to be foregrounded and to be listened to by people who are generally sympathetic, but maybe don't know exactly how to go about it. So when you have some time, check out Freedom is the Future, and it addresses some things that we're bringing up and that will continue to be referenced, throughout the sequence of the roundtable. But I just thought it would be good to plug that, given that we're talking about all the ways that erasure happens, erasure plays out. So some concrete ways a lot of us are working on in real time for how to counteract that. So moving back to the list of questions, we've obviously talked a lot about repression, erasure, and silencing, and I think toward the end we sort of got a great sampling of this next thing that I'm about to reference from what Nas was mentioning. So Nas, even if you'd like to start this one, feel free. But I think it's important to note that inclusion, right, isn't always inherently positive. So people may claim to be uplifting Palestinian voices while still engaging in activity or behavior that actively undermines the Palestinian struggle. Could some of you speak briefly to this dynamic? What problematic or limited ways of trying to center Palestine or Palestinian voices have you encountered? And how can this pattern be productively avoided? So Nas, I like that you went back to the anecdote that we mentioned in the introduction. So definitely I think I had Al-Qaus and the anecdote in mind while writing it, but also Sahir, I'm thinking of the work of Ademir centering Palestinian prisoners and talking about the colonial reality of imprisonment and making sure that that's not left out of the conversation. So if either of you want to start us off, but in general, if folks have responses to this idea of the problematic ways of trying to center Palestine while really actually leaving out the voices that are supposed to be centered, definitely take it away.
Thanks, Omar. Yeah, I think this is a tricky question, and it really gets to the heart of, what does it mean to center Palestinian voices? Because we're at a point now where it's fairly common for queer Palestinians to be called upon, summoned to express, explain, and interpret issues in the news. But this form of inclusion is always mediated, and often our voices are selectively filtered and interpreted in order to fit particular agendas. And I actually want to go back to an example that happened last August, before this most recent New York Times debacle, but was also in the New York Times, which was about their coverage of, the moment last August where the Palestinian Authority banned the activities of Al-Qaus in the West Bank. It painted a target on the backs of activists by calling them foreign agents and attempting to erase them from their rightful place in the Palestinian national community. But we saw that there was astonishingly little media attention paid afterwards to the story that followed, which was the story of how the PA withdrew its police statement and scaled back its repression after an outpouring of support from various grassroots organizations across Palestine, which basically said your divide and conquer tactics aren't going to work here, and you definitely won't get away with papering over your own corruption with a false defense of traditional values. And that's a testament to the growing scope and power of the queer movement in Palestine after 2 decades of grounded local organizing. But the fact that only one part of the story got told in a manner which completely erased the agency and scope of the movement in Palestine is a testament to the fact that even in the realm of objective reporting, we still have to grapple with the erasure of Palestinians and our critical analysis, and coverage that only is a partial reflection of the reality that we often have to deal with. Yeah.
This is Sahar again. So I think in silencing the voices of the prisoners, or the kind of work that Damir do, is also lately were led by usually NGOs like the NGO Monitor, UK for Israel, and other groups that we believe they are associated with the Israeli government, that they're trying to publish these reports against Damir and of course against other organizations, including in these reports false allegations and information, but it all came in order to make Damir looks like a terrorist organization or associated with terrorism, and basically in order to send a message that we are not an objective or we are not really a human rights organization. But it got, in some places, it got more beyond just publishing these reports. For example, if you have an activity or event in the EU, sometimes we will discover when we organize, for example, a speaking tour in the EU or any certain country. I would give an example of Germany, for example, and you would ask for meetings with MPs or with public figures like diplomatic figures, and then in the last moment they will cancel the meeting. So it's for sure out of the lobbying of all these groups that they are trying to incite against the Palestinian organizations and make it very difficult. And this is what we call the shrinking space campaign that they are leading. And lately they're attacking a lot our donors as well, like trying to affect, because sometimes they don't succeed with such smear campaigns that they are pushing. So the other way to silence us is to dry our financial resources and to make it very difficult for us to sustain and continue in our usual work that we do. And mostly, I think organizations that they deal with the accountability issue, especially on the international level, and trying to connect between PDS activism as an accountability act, public accountability act actually, with legal strategies for accountability would be targeted more, because it seems that this is really successful. From the other side, this shows that we are succeeding in these campaigns.
Yeah, perhaps I'm just add a very short comment here. This is Yara. One of the ways that, well, there have been many ways in which attempts to include Palestinian voices haven't really hit the mark. And some, are done by allies and they are meant well, and it's a case of calling in rather than calling out. And other efforts or examples are actually done insidiously with, a specific purpose in mind, a specific narrative in mind. To give perhaps an anecdotal example, I was invited to participate in a EU program on Palestinian youth leadership in the sort of policy and analysis world, and the requirements for such candidates to be admitted to this program were those who are committed to the two-state solution. Now, I rejected participation in this on several grounds, ideological, but also because this political framework was being imposed. And this is something that we see very common that happens in Palestine on the ground, is that outside forces in the international community, the donor community, are not only shaping their narrative, they're holding Palestinians and Palestinian civil society to a certain narrative that they want pursued, or they want to encourage, and it's a really difficult situation. And Sahar talked about this, that there is a case of being held hostage to this donor community, and that they have a certain political narrative in mind. And this is just one example, and there are many examples. But another thing that I want to point out is that something that still happens, and It doesn't surprise me that it still happens, but it's infuriating nonetheless, is that many of the Palestinian voices that are always seem to be included are male voices. And people often don't seem to have a problem with having a panel, an all-male panel with not a single Palestinian female voice. And too often the excuse is used are that the Palestinian women are not there. There aren't. They didn't apply for the conference. They didn't apply for the panel. But that is something that also needs challenging, not only within Palestinian society, but also in international events where this happens far too often.
And I guess as a more kind of personal example of just like what it feels like to be, a Palestinian living in the US, where the dominant narrative is so deeply anti-Palestinian, would be, for example, I knew two people who were running for a student government office and who asked me to come and talk to them about the Palestinian issue. And which was a situation where, I kind of had to just sit down and recount as much as I could in that time about, like our Palestinian trauma and our struggle. And I think there's a huge difference between, uplifting our knowledge and our lived experiences and tokenizing us and putting us in situations where we need to prove our trauma to other people, which I think is harmful and damaging to ourselves and our own peace. And yeah, and I think that it can definitely be seen in, again, like reproduced in outside structures. And I also think this tendency to kind of, have conversations and invite Palestinians to the table to have conversations is, again, a very harmful kind of practice, which reduces our struggle and our trauma to, something that is up for debate and can be talked about. When all that knowledge is out there and has been put out there by Palestinians. And it's not that it's not there, it's just that, people are not listening to that.
Yeah, this is Omar. Thank you all for your responses. And Tala, I particularly appreciate the more personal context that you added toward the end, because I think it really helps us center that on the one hand, there's a perspective or there's a presence, but sometimes there's also, what can still act as a form of, silencing or erasure, or if not total silencing or erasure, is this idea that it needs to fit into a particular box. And if it doesn't fit into that box, then it's rejected, right? So the way that stories are also organized or thought of, right, also becomes a way in which things are left out, even if you have this optic where it's, oh, okay, well, I'm going to talk to this person or I'm going to include them. In reality, it's including on very specific terms or also excluding on specific terms, right? So on that note, I want to kind of scale out a little bit and to continue talking about that pattern of trying to tell a particular story or tell a narrative, that on the surface seems, inclusive and untroubled, but may actually be masking something deeper, right? And here I'm referring in particular to the United Arab Emirates' decision to normalize relations with Israel, right? Because, and I'm sure some of you have noticed this, there's kind of a specific narrative being presented in, certain forms of media, this idea that it's simply about two countries, have chosen to establish relations, and also even more problematically that, the UAE's actions are helping to sort of undermine annexation, right? And so, and even this thing of, oh, well, now, Al-Aqsa is open to the world. So all of these really problematic and yet sort of pervasive tropes that we're seeing recycled. So I'd like to invite, panelists to kind of respond to this. Tell us why are these narratives problematic? What are they ignoring? And I'm thinking in particular of Yara and Sahar, but anybody else, of course, feel free to jump in on this question as well.
Thank you, Omar. This is Yara. I think one of the major problems with the discussion around the UAE sort of normalization deal with Israel is that this is not something that's particularly new. The difference is that it's a formalization of ongoing relations, ongoing sort of discussions that Israel have been having with the UAE for quite some time. The idea that these were sort of two big enemies that have finally, you know, with the guidance of the Trump administration, come together to some form of agreement is not the case at all. And I think that is also applicable to the notion of annexation, that also annexation is not something new. It's a formalization of an ongoing process of land theft. And I think it's important to highlight the ongoing nature of the Israeli settler colonial regime, that this isn't, none of the things that are happening now are new, rather that it's following a trajectory, a political trajectory that has been ongoing. And I think many of us have underestimated the Israeli regime. Many of us in particular have underestimated Benjamin Netanyahu and this whole sort of annexation discussion. Many people are now thinking or seeing that actually for Netanyahu, the discussion and the debate around annexation was really just a smokescreen, that he never intended to formally annex. Rather, he was using it all the time as a potential political bargaining chip, and we've seen that. We've seen that with the UAE deal. What he got was in exchange for a halting of the annexation. Now, of course, we know that annexation is not halted. It will not be halted. Annexation really just means land theft, and Israel will continue and is continuing now every second to steal Palestinian land, to displace Palestinian people, to incarcerate them. So really all of this is a continuation, and I think we have to be very careful when we talk about these things, that these are not new processes. These are not new processes. They really are just, you know, developments and part of a continuing trajectory of Israeli policy.
Yeah, this is Sahar again. I think on this issue of the agreement between Israel and the UAE, I would take it a step further, not just from the political side, but I mean what is serious about what's going on, that in the international level, there is totally putting aside the whole question of the response, like the accountability. Again, like it's really very important to put it in the context of what it means when an Arab state is doing a peace agreement with Israel as a colonizing country, as more like as an apartheid system. This gives justification for all these policies with the support of the United States and the welcoming of other states. It means as states you fail to recognize your own responsibility to respect the Palestinian self-determination right enshrined in the UN different rules and decisions since 70 years. So it means when you would reach this stage where you recognize the right of the Palestinian people, and as states, you are obliged to put an end for all these violations, including the theft of the land. Because for me, in the reality on the ground, if you take the strategies and the policies and the actions that Israel is implementing on the daily level, I don't think there is a green line anymore. There is a difference between what's going on inside Israel as an oppression against the Palestinian community, citizens of the state, and the Palestinians living in the occupied territories. Because if you will take the house demolitions are taking place against Palestinian communities in both sides. Legal repression through the criminal procedures and the legal system inside Israel, with the military system imposed in the Palestinians in the occupied territory as well, and so on. We can make this similarities on the apartheid policies. So this is a huge question for the United Emirates and other countries when making peace with Israel, when recognizing Israel, like, don't you think that you're violating your own responsibilities in the international level toward the Palestinian cause by ignoring totally how you are going to guarantee the right of the Palestinian people for self-determination? And I think this is why it's very essential for us activists to start to put the context of apartheid on the table, and to push for reactivating the UN Committee for Apartheid, because this is a very serious crime on the international level, and all those associated and complicit and supporting apartheid regime should be responsible, not less than Israel as the main perpetrator here in this situation.
Great, thank you for all of your responses. This is Omar again, and I think Sahar, your response in particular sets us up really well for the next question, which is that, given that you all represent organizations that come from many different spheres of, activism and organizing, right? I wanted to get a sense of what do each of you, so this is actually for all of the speakers, whatever space you find yourself in, what do each of you feel is the role of policy, right, in the Palestinian struggle, given that, policy itself has often been an instrument for undermining or sabotaging or betraying Palestinians time and time again, right? So what do you think is the function, if anything, of policy work, and what do you feel your relationship is to policy? What do you think, how do you think we should frame it when we're contextualizing the Palestinian struggle for freedom and for liberation?
I can start again. This is Yara. I think policy is really a difficult world for many radicals to navigate, because it's essentially about reforming a system that was broken and that was stacked against us from the very start. But I do think that there are certain things that we can do, those of us who do work in this world, to make it easier for Palestinians on the ground to resist settler colonialism. I think, pursuing policies to end military aid to Israel, or trying to ensure that settlement produce cannot enter countries legally, for example, all of these things put a strain on Israel, and I think, therefore, help in the resistance effort against it. But the question really is about finding the right balance and putting the right amount of effort. And I think as Palestinians, we haven't always gotten this balance right. We have to use a variety of tools. I don't think we should be putting all of our eggs in one basket. Now, part of the reason we have done that in the past is that, and continue to do that, is because we lack leadership and strategy, quite frankly. And I think this is why, new leadership should be a priority of Palestinians, so leadership that is democratic, representative of Palestinians and all their components, and a leadership that is revolutionary. I know in the US it's particularly tough because you have, the two main parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, really, sort of fighting it out to see who can be Israel's biggest ally. And change on that institutional level is so huge, and it's almost unimaginable. But I think if we widen our vision, not just to Palestinian liberation, but liberation for all of those struggling against these oppressive structures, I think it becomes more imaginable. And, really defending Palestine, even in the policy world, as a natural part of the struggle for justice and the struggle against imperialism and anti-capitalism, it's not necessarily an easy feat, but it really is a necessary one. And language and narrative in this sense really do matter. And I think this is where we sort of can continue to agitate and continue to disrupt. But of course, this comes with a responsibility on our end also to live our politics. So, we cannot demand, anti-capitalists to adopt our struggle as their own if we do not believe in anti-capitalist politics and so on. So I know the odds are stacked against us in the policy world. And that's why, again, you know, I stress about this need for balance, that there are so many different tools at our disposal that we can't, you know, focus on only one. We, you know, collectively have to put the right amount of energy into different sort of tools and different avenues.
This is Tada speaking, and yeah, I think you used the kind of perfect word within the question itself of, you know, agitating, because I think our relationship to mainstream US politics should be a hostile one, but we should continue to do so to be able to, you know, create conditions that are favorable to resistance and favorable to liberation, because we know that politicians are not going to lead the way on our resistance or on our liberation. They never have, and they never will. But the fact is that policy can do more harm to our cause. And if we don't try to mitigate that, we will be, you know, in a, it will complicate, you know, the efforts that we are trying to do. So, you know, for example, in the case of anti-BDS laws that are attempting to be enacted, that could, you know, significantly harm grassroots organizing and advocacy on the ground that can result in, you know, ground up changes. And also, you know, for example, Trump cutting funding to UNRWA, you know, obviously relying on that sort of funding perpetuates a system of dependence on the benevolence of Western powers, which is not part of our vision for liberation, but it does have immediate and tangible effects to the people on the ground. And we absolutely need to center them in what we are doing at this moment. So I think, as Yara was saying, you know, there are so many different tools that we can and should be using, and we should not treat you know, mainstream politics as the primary or the only one. But I think we should use that as we continue to build, you know, a ground up, more sustainable and kind of long-term vision of peace and justice for all.
Basically, I totally agree with Yara and Tala and wouldn't repeat what they were saying, because I really also believe in this connection between our own struggle on the different areas, for example, prisoners or anti-capitalism or any other, with the international level, especially with what's going on in the United States itself. I think it's very important to think about joint strategies, how we bring change, because as a lawyer, for me, it's very worrying what's going on in the level of the international law and the elaboration on the international law and the double standard in implementing tools of the international law on different states. Why it's working when it's a weak country and the international community can impose sanctions, but it's never used against Israel, where they know exactly that it could be implemented. So this is why such a law to ban the US support for Israel, financing the arms and ending up with all these violations on the ground, whether torture, the policing, and so on, shouldn't be promoted in the United States. So this is the kind of work that we should think more and more. At the end of the day, just the sanctions would work and would enforce Israel actually to respect their obligation according to the international law.
You know, really wonderful remarks from all the panelists. Tala kind of spoke to it. You know, Palestine Legal's theory of change is that change can only come from the grassroots. You know, policy tends to be from top down rather than the other way around, where the grassroots informs and shapes the laws and systems that affect the lives of the people on the ground. And more, these policies are shaped by lobbyists, special interests, corporate forces, which bolster capitalist, supremacist, classist structures that have created this society, you know, structures that wage war, that wage poverty, that wage criminalization on, you know, communities of color. And that's why we see networks kind of like ALEC, you know, the American Legislative Exchange Council, emerge. It's a right-wing, pro-corporate lobbying organization that drives a lot of the legislation that hurts communities of color. They push a lot of terrible laws, like, stand your ground laws that actively justify trampling Black life, to harsh, penalties for protecting water and land and Indigenous sovereignty. Their very mission is to pass policy that undermines our right to narrate. And if we just look at these anti-boycott laws, we have 30 states with law in the books that restrict some form of solidarity with Palestinians. And these laws were not developed by any popular demand because, constituents asked for them, but because of right-wing policy groups like ALEC and like pressure from Israel. And the reason why Israel and ALEC can push these laws is because they see the power of BDS campaigns to shift the narrative to what's happening in Palestine and who's responsible and who's complicit. Because the BDS movement is moving churches, it's moving student governments, it's moving Hollywood stars, unions, academic associations. It's gaining ground, and it's gaining ground fast. As a legal organization, we see our role as supporting the grassroots movement as they dictate those, what it is that they want from policy. And we know we can't do that without kind of a radical reorientation. Imagine a world where policy did reflect the grassroots. And that's what initiatives like Freedom is the Future, like Movement for Black Lives Policy Platform, like the Red Nation Principles, they're demanding that the conversations start and end with this vision and the needs of those most affected, and not by the perpetrators of injustice.
Hi, this is Naz again. I think maybe come at this question from like a different angle, because like everyone sort of mentioned, the choice to engage in policy work, I think looks much different on the ground here and in certain contexts than it does in the context that Al-Qaus is working in. Here we can see that there's a very obvious sense of solidarity between settler states and imperial states, solidarity in the very material sense in terms of military aid and loan guarantees, and one that needs to be combated through an internationalist approach. So from that angle, any attempt to undercut the US's sponsorship of Israeli colonialism is meaningful for all Palestinians, and policy work like BDS advocacy is a tool that can allow us to take space for ourselves in anticipation of a broader liberatory vision. And I think the experience of Al-Qaus is interesting to look at because they're essentially organizing as a stateless organization. And that's part of what enabled it to develop an approach to organizing across colonial boundaries, across all of Palestine. We're often used to thinking in many ways that we can only build power through direct engagement to the state or appeals to policy. But when you don't have a state to appeal to, because that state is premised on your exclusion, or it's like the PA and it's just subcontracting that exclusion, you have to look at other avenues. So for Al-Qaus, which initially began in Jerusalem, this took the form of, working across these various contexts that not only required a total autonomy from Israeli civil society and mainstream Israeli LGBTQ politics, both of which are heavily invested in maintaining the Zionist nature of the state, but it also required us to think, what does that joining imply for the politics that we're going to adopt? And I think that is significant in the sense of the horizon beyond, living the kind of Palestine we dream, a Palestine where we can, work across, all of these imposed fragmentations and erasures in order to really imagine what our future will be.
Thank you. And so obviously, I think this conversation could continue for hours, but we're running low on time. So I think I'm going to ask what should be the final question in the roundtable. And I'm going to sort of bring it back to the US context. Over here, we've been seeing a firm rejection of what we might call a racial or a settler colonial common sense in actions like people tearing down Confederate and settler statues, right? And I think these actions are actually very profound because they represent the uncompromising rejection of the idea that, that's just the way things are, nothing will change, so you need to get over it and move on, right? So my question is, how do you all think we can apply that same spirit of refusing to accept historic and ongoing injustice as a given? How can we apply that same refusal to the question of Palestine in all of the work that you all are doing and the work that people can do in general moving forward. And Tala, I'd like to start with you on this one, since you're sort of, doing your activism in the belly of the beast, as it were. But of course, anybody else who'd like to jump on, feel free.
Did you say Tada?
Yes.
Okay, cool, just to make sure. This is Tada speaking. I would say, since probably the most popular example of the settler colonial logic that drove the creation of Israel was, the slogan, "A land without people for people without a land." I think, in many cases, settler colonial logic seeks to collapse the identity of the indigenous group to their relationship with their land and justify the forced expulsion or extermination of that group on the basis of that constructed identity for access to that land. Yet we were denied even that construction because we were denied the right to exist in the first place. And so, while I don't know of any specific statues that we could tear down off the top of my head, I think we need to be loud about our history, our indigeneity, and our agency. We need to, uplift Palestinian art and be keepers of our own history. And perhaps, I think one, very powerful way that we can do that as Palestinians is to turn to our elders and preserve their knowledge and experiences, because, what could possibly be a more radical rejection of settler colonial logic than to know someone who has lived longer than the settler colonial project itself. Our Palestinian grandparents probably have, and perhaps they have passports or papers or deeds to their house or anything that kind of strikes at the heart of a land without people, including and especially their oral histories that we need to preserve and reproduce and be public and loud about. And I guess maybe a good example of that is how Bella Hadid posted a passport of her grandparents that said, Palestine on it. And I think, that's an incredibly powerful thing to be able to do. I guess some other examples too of, being keepers of our own history and preserving that, would be the Palestine Museum in DC that I haven't had the opportunity to visit yet, but I think is, something that's incredible. But also, like Totris and Tea, which is something that seeks to, continue reproducing and teaching Totris as, kind of the sacred form of Palestinian art and culture, and preserve that. And so I think all those things are very, kind of radical rejections of settler colonial logic.
Tala, gosh, so many, spitting fire. Everything that Tala just said is absolutely on point. And by the way, this is Amira speaking. Palestinians have always resisted their colonization and dispossession. And just as Tala was saying, we should be keepers of our own history and look to our elders for wisdom. We should also look to other freedom movements for wisdom, for their tradition and their thoughts. So just as we have resisted colonization and dispossession, so have indigenous people here, and so have enslaved people here in the US as well. The uprisings for Black lives in the US today has shifted the US discourse at a critical breaking ground in anti-Black policies and racial capitalism. The focus of the uprisings and the grassroots movement for Black lives is not on reforming the current systems, but on abolishing them, and on reimagining a world that doesn't need police or prisons, because Black lives are valued and cared for, and Black people are free to live and thrive on their own terms. And if we think of the first Intifada, there's a similar spirit of throwing off the straitjacket of the occupation and building a self-sustainable community that didn't need Israeli services and goods and jobs to thrive. The danger, of course, is when these grassroots movements are co-opted. And negotiations are made behind the backs of people most affected, without a fundamental reckoning with the roots of historical and current injustices. And then we end up with civil rights laws and legislation that only scratches the surface of, fundamental problems of colonization and racial capitalism. And I think it's also important that we recognize when we do see the same spirit of refusing to accept historic and ongoing injustice. Tala provided so many wonderful examples. I think one thing that comes to mind for me is it's 70 years past the Nakba, and grassroots movements are continuing to talk about refugees and demanding their return, and that's just the start of the demands. The key remains this incredibly symbolic icon of who we are and the beginning of our demands. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you for your responses. So, again, I would love to go on all day, but I think given the time, we're going to need to draw things to a close. I'd like to thank the participants once again for joining us from all of your different time zones, all of your different contexts, and with all that, that has been going on throughout the world. We've been dropping resources from you as individuals and your organizations, in the chat. So folks should definitely check those out. And I would like to thank Anthony for the ASL interpretation, Gabriella and Anthony for the closed captioning, and Sana and Leah, who've been, really the masterminds behind the scene in making sure all of this runs smoothly. Yeah, I hope everybody else, enjoys the rest of your day and finds either rest or power, whatever it is you're about to move on to next. At Eyewitness Palestine, we're going to be streaming the event Indigenous Black and Brown Liberation. So if you're on our page, definitely check that out. Thank you again. It's been a pleasure to share space with you. And I hope that really this is only, I know it's only the beginning. Make sure to check out Freedom is the Future and continue to look for collaborations and the ongoing need to uplift Palestinian voices and demands, in all of our organizing work. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll follow up with folks via email, so you will get, these resources and links, and we'll share ways to continue to be involved in these campaigns and to connect further with our speakers. But thank you everyone for your time today.